The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. In the last 10 presidential elections, the Republicans have won 7 times and the Democrats only 3 times. And, for the past 10 years, except for a few short months when one senator changed parties, the GOP has controlled both houses of Congress. Why have Republicans been so successful? Were they more in tune with the voters? Did the demographics of the electorate change in their favor? Did they field more attractive candidates? And what should Democrats do to become more competitive? To find out, Policy Watch is joined this week by William Galston, Interim Dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and Presidential Campaign Advisor to Walter Mondale, Al Gore, and Bill Clinton.
Bill, welcome to Policy Watch here at the University of Maryland.
Glad to be here, Doug.
Bill, you were trained in philosophy.
I plead guilty, I was.
How did a philosopher end up in politics?
Well, I have a confession to make. I've been a political junkie as long as I can remember. I remember we were overseas during the 1960 presidential election. I had my wall plastered, with the states and the electoral votes, and I was in Australia, which meant, of course, we were totally reversed in time, and I stayed up all night, all day. I can't remember. I was just so passionate about it, and that has always been with me through my academic studies.
And to remind our audience, that was another one of those cliffhangers. California wasn't decided till the next morning, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and the famous anecdote, of course, from that election is that Jack Kennedy calls up Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, at 2 in the morning. Illinois is still out, and in particular, Cook County is still out.
Mm-hmm.
And, Kennedy asks Daley, well, how many votes am I going to get in Cook County? And Daley pauses for a minute, says, how many do you need?
Unfortunately, since 2000, that kind of joke, and we took it lightly in those days, has now returned to haunt us, and almost in this last election, big time, with 10,000 lawyers ready to pounce on any irregularities.
Thank God they were unemployed.
Boy, oh boy. I think that's important, and we're going to talk about everything that happened in the election and the very bad news, at least the temporary bad news for Democrats, but we should remember that for the country as a whole, it's just a good thing that we're not in court today.
Absolutely.
So your first real connection with electoral politics was with John Anderson?
No, as a matter of fact, since it's true confessions time.
Fair enough.
My family of origin has leaned to the left historically, and I am told that I passed out literature for Henry Wallace and the Independent Progressive Party in 1948 at the age of 2. I'm told that my street corner rap was not bad. I think it's gotten a little better since then. But I was a young assistant professor at the University of Texas, and I became passionately involved in the Carter campaign at the state level. God save me, I even served as the chairman of the Rules Committee of Travis County, Texas, Democratic Party at the county convention, and I made some appalling blunders because I didn't know any better. I still don't know to this day why they put me in charge of the Rules Committee, but the Carter campaign was really another cliffhanger, of course. And many Democrats believe that if the campaign had lasted another week or two, Gerald Ford would have been elected president because Jimmy Carter had a 30 percentage point edge coming out of the Democratic convention, and 28 of those percentage points disappeared during the general election.
Talking about truth-telling, you were involved in the Mondale campaign. Now, another issue that continues to be with us is no new taxes.
Yes.
John Kerry said he was not going to raise taxes on anyone except the mythical top 2% of the population. You worked for a man who said, I'm going to raise your taxes, and there I just told you so.
As a matter of fact, I am the unindicted co-conspirator.
This is Walter Mondale.
This is Walter Mondale in that famous paragraph in his acceptance speech. Wish the other guy who did it were in the room so that he could take his fair share of the blame.
Let me read it. Yes, I'm going to raise your taxes, and Ronald Reagan will raise your taxes. The difference is he's not going to tell you, and I just did. 2 questions.
Yes.
First, although there were subsequent increases in the taxes, Ronald Reagan actually lowered our taxes.
Well, to be precise, he lowered them in 1981, and then he raised them in 1982, and then he raised them in 1980, et cetera. So, Ronald Reagan, unlike some other presidents I could mention, had the courage to admit that a mid-course correction was needed on the tax front.
Why is it so difficult to raise taxes? Why is the political rhetoric now, no new taxes?
Look, no one likes to pay taxes. And whether or not a tax is sustainable depends on whether enough people accept the truth of what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said 3/4 of a century ago, namely that taxes are the price that we pay for civilization, right? Or as the Bible reminded us with reference to the plight of the Israelites in Egypt, you really can't make bricks without straw. If we want to do the things that we need to do at home and abroad, and to do it in a fiscally sustainable way, then there needs to be a balance between what we spend and the revenues to support it. But to the extent that people become convinced that government is not their government, it's someone else's government, it's remote, distant, unresponsive, not delivering value for dollar, mired in the past, all of the things that too many people say about it, with some truth in some cases, then it becomes very, very difficult to sustain a sensible tax regime.
Almost anywhere. Now, there are exceptions, and I think in Colorado some referenda raise taxes, but I'm here to tell you that in Berkeley, California, the citadel of whatever, 4 referenda to raise taxes failed. And I think it's because what you said, which is in general people might be supportive of paying their fair share. They worry where the money is going, and they're not persuaded that the government is as efficient as it ought to be. You've written about this.
I have, although I have to say that government is a lot more efficient than people give it credit for being. And important segments of the government, including very large and very popular programs like Social Security and Medicare, are in fact very efficiently administered. I would challenge any private sector firm to administer these tens of millions of Social Security accounts as efficiently and effectively as the Social Security Administration does. And I could multiply these examples. The fact of the matter is that through most of its history, Americans have been anti-statist. Our political culture is suspicious of government, suspicious of concentrations of power. We are at the opposite pole from France in that respect. France is the most statist of the advanced industrialized democracies.
So there's another reason not to like them, is that right?
Well, and vice versa. It is no coincidence that that we and the French have been in ideological loggerheads almost since the inception. And Alexis Tocqueville, by the way, wrote Democracy in America to explain America to his fellow countrymen, not to explain us to ourselves, but explain us to them. And that's a tough job.
But you said that the American public doesn't appreciate what the government does. Part of that, isn't it, is our leadership. I think, with the exception of John Anderson, everyone since 1976 who's run for president has run against Washington. Have I got something wrong? Hasn't every candidate on both parties tried to portray himself as an outsider and run against the Washington establishment?
I think it would be an exaggeration to say that Bill Clinton ran against Washington. Bill Clinton ran against what he took to be the establishment of the Democratic Party, but that was a different matter. And what he said was, I'm going to remake my party so that my party can then execute a program that will remake the country. But it was not an anti-government campaign in the sense in which Carter's 76 campaign was anti-government, and for good reason, an entirely different set of issues.
Before we get to the Clinton presidency, let's go through some of these other failed campaigns that you were involved in. Al Gore. And you mentioned one of the things that you liked about John Anderson was his position about gun control, which I take it was in favor of gun control. Is that right?
Very much.
Yeah. It is widely thought, I think, that Al Gore lost in 2000, not in Florida, but in Tennessee and West Virginia and so forth. And that was because of the gun control issue. Mm-hmm. Is that your sense?
Well, let me begin by saying that I'm one of the few people in the known universe to have gone down with the good ship Gore not once but twice, because I was also with him in his failed run for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1988, a campaign I will never forget.
You do pick them.
Oh, yes. Well, if there were a political version of the three strikes and you're out law, I would have been out of the game long before I entered the Clinton White House. But certainly in 2000, all of the surveys that I've seen post-election suggested that in the critical border states, including his own state, states that Bill Clinton carried not once but twice, the gun control issue was critical. That it wasn't just an issue; it stood for an entire cultural sensibility that crucial voters in those states simply could not accept.
Now, you've written, is this what you refer to as the white male problem?
That's one of them. Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about that white male problem.
Well,
we'll say that as two white males, of course.
We are the problem, absolutely. Now, the rest of the country knows it. The Democrats' white male problem is very simply that over the past generation, fewer and fewer white men have been willing to identify themselves with the Democratic Party or to support its candidates. And over time, the Republican edge among white men has tended to grow. Clinton contained it for various reasons, but it has expanded to very large proportions again. And you need huge numbers among women and among minorities in order to counterbalance a 15 or 20-point Republican edge among white men. I think that the gun issue had something to do with that. The national security issue had something to do with that. But let me be absolutely candid, and that is that the Democratic Party, for reasons that I not only accept but applaud, has been the party of the rectification of ancient wrongs for 2 generations now, in the civil rights movement, in the women's movement, and in a number of other areas as well. But it is understandable that many white men have felt challenged and threatened by these movements of rectification. And they have tended to look at the Democratic Party and say to themselves, this is a party that cares more about every other group in the country than it does about us. Why should we stick with them? And I don't think that we've given them a compelling reason to stick with us, and we need to do better.
But in 2004, I don't want to exaggerate it, but some of those other groups seem to have left the Democratic fold. You know the numbers better than I, but let me just read them off. The Hispanic vote went from 35% Republican to about 44%.
Right.
Catholic vote from 47% to 52%.
Right.
The Jewish vote from 19% to 25%, and 66% of Orthodox Jews voted for George Bush. And even among African Americans, his numbers were up. The striking one, we may get to faith-based services in a moment, among black Christian conservatives, his vote went from 11% to 36%. The only good news for John Kerry was young voters. You might want to talk about that. But isn't this a sign that it's not just that the Democrats have a problem or could have a problem even with a traditional base, because the country is changing, becoming more wealthy, wanting more choices?
Well, let me give you a mixed verdict on that question. On the one hand, I think the Democratic Party has a long-term problem, and I don't mean to minimize it. On the other hand, I think it's important not to draw outsized conclusions from a single election. I will say this. The Democratic Party has not had a functioning national majority since 1968. I believe actually 1966, but certainly not since 1968. During that period, Republican candidates have averaged about 50% of the popular vote, Democrats about 45% of the popular vote.
And we should remind people that the first time Bill Clinton won, he won, it was a third person in the race, but with only 43% of the popular vote.
And the second time he only got 49. Only one Democrat has gotten a majority of the popular vote since 1964.
A Democrat that some Democrats are embarrassed about.
Well, I'm not embarrassed about Jimmy Carter, but the fact of the matter is that during that same period, Republicans have gotten more than the majority of the popular vote 5 times. So we're not talking about a new problem. And by the way, although your statistics on Hispanics are absolutely correct, that's not a new problem either. Ronald Reagan, 20 years ago, did exceedingly well with Hispanics. And then the Hispanic tide for Republicans receded, but now it seems to be fuller again. And I do think that this is a serious matter for Democrats, because all of the analyses of the future Democratic majority based on demographic changes assume that Hispanics will tend to vote Democratic. And if that's not true, then that entire scenario has to be pitched overboard.
Here's what you wrote. Clearly, this was after the 2004 elections. Clearly, we, I guess Democrats, have to re-examine ourselves from the ground up. The shock and surprise of the party's defeat will lead us to reconsideration of the message, messenger, and a number of other things. Let's take a look at those 3 before we turn to the audience for questions. The message. What's the message that the Democrats should have?
Well, I'm not sure we had a very clear message in 2004. So the first implication of this campaign is that we should have a message. We need to be clearer and more pointed. The party has been divided against itself on foreign policy issues since Vietnam. Those divisions were minimized during the 1990s, but the new global situation has tended to bring them out again. We need, a solid, muscular, internationalist, democratic foreign policy, and we have people in the party who articulated that very well. People like Senator Joe Biden, for example, has been talking a lot of sense. On the economy, quite frankly, I don't think we had a message that convinced people that we could address the new challenges of the global economy. We did not have a narrative for individual and family success in the new global economy. And relatively small bore ideas like changing the tax code to encourage creation of jobs at home as opposed to jobs overseas. That's a step in the right direction. I think Senator Kerry was onto something there, but it was a policy. It wasn't a story of how we succeed.
Now, why hasn't there been that story developed?
Well, the simple answer to that question is that this is a new situation. It's an unprecedented situation. We now have, in the past 10 years, the increasingly rapid integration of 2.5 billion Chinese and Indians into the global economy. This is the second wave of marketization of the global economy. We have never been in a world when American workers are competing head-to-head with 2.5 billion Chinese and Indians like this, and we are going to have to re-examine our premises. And frankly, this is not an easy matter. It's not something where you can snap your fingers and come up with a new global economic program. We are really going to have to figure out what our education policy is, what our trade policy is, what a pro-economic growth diplomatic stance for the United States is, and Democrats are going to have to think hard about this. But by the way, I've been silent on Republicans up to now. But Republicans are going to have to start paying attention to what serious people like Alan Greenspan are saying, namely that a policy, an economic policy that is predicated on $500 billion of budget deficits and current account imbalances on an annual basis is not something the rest of the world is going to accept very long. So we're all in the same boat. It's a new game, and we have to devise new policies.
Let's turn to our audience and see if there are questions from the audience. Please come to the standing mic to ask your question.
My question deals with the ownership society. It became a buzzword in this campaign. It's really a Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, third wave kind of idea, but it seems like the Republican Party, particularly now with working majorities, might be able to pull off that agenda of you as Americans can choose how to fund your retirement, how to make health care work for you and your family and your circumstances, how to choose education, charter schools, vouchers, and that sort of thing. It seems like the penultimate, response to mistrust of government and bigness in general. How do the Democrats try to capture that part of the electorate, and can they do so without offending trade unionists and other natural allies?
The question of how to respond to the challenge of the ownership society, I think, is something that Democrats are going to have to think through very carefully. And there is a diversity of views on that subject within the Democratic Party. My own view is that ownership and self-control, control of one's resources, one's family, one's education, is a pretty deeply ingrained American value, and that Democrats should think of ways of doing it that also preserve a safety net, also honor our basic principles of fairness. An example: during the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton actually proposed private accounts as part of Social Security, and more than that, he proposed to make them progressive by having a matching system where for the lowest income workers, if a worker contributed $1, the government would add $2 to that. For middle income workers, it would be a one-to-one match, and so it went. And that is the kind of take on an ownership society that I think Democrats could support. What they cannot support is, for example, changes in the Social Security system that would dramatically worsen the condition of low-wage workers in this country. That would be both, I think, a practical mistake and a moral mistake.
After the 2004 election, there was a lot made of the maps, and you would see the 2000 and the 2004 county maps, and I guess to my untrained eye, the thing that struck me as interesting was how little movement there seemed to be between those two maps, even though the 2000-2004 elections were so different, very different candidates, even President Bush was a very different candidate from one election to another, and very different issues, national security and terrorism. And it strikes me that a lot of the big changes seem to happen along geographical lines, blue areas being bluer, red areas being redder. Is there a real geographical determinism happening in electoral politics, at least on the national level? And if there is there any reason to expect 2008 will be different, and what is it that Democrats can do to actually move people over?
First of all, 2004 was a lot like 2000, right? I mean, George Bush added a couple of percentage points to his total in 2000, and John Kerry got just a shade of a percentage point less in the popular vote than Al Gore did. Of the 50 states, I believe only 3 actually switched columns. So there was a lot of continuity, and there was a lot of continuity in voting patterns as well, as long as with some changes that we've discussed among women, among Hispanics, and other groups, and among young people who turned out in record numbers and supported John Kerry by a margin of about 10 percentage points. So I don't think there is geographical determinism, which brings me to my second point. I don't think in politics there is strict determinism of any sort. Abraham Lincoln once candidly confessed that events were in the saddle. He was president, but events were in the saddle. And you can think of all sorts of things that could happen in the next 4 years, things as hard to predict as the events of the past 4 years, which could scramble and reconfigure our politics all over again. We really don't know how the economy is going to bear up, against the pressure, the unrelenting pressure of the twin deficits, budget deficit and the trade deficit. We still don't know whether Iraq is going to succeed or fail. We don't know whether there's going to be another terrorist attack on American soil. I could list a very long roster of things that we don't know, any one of which, if it were to occur, would reconfigure political debate in this country.
And the Republicans could overreach.
The history of second term presidency, where the president begins with most or all of the reins of power in his hand, that history is not entirely encouraging.
Well, on that note of hope for the Democrats, Bill Galston, thanks again for joining us here on Policy Watch and at the University of Maryland. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.